Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this latest edition of Thinking Aloud. Today, I am joined by Richard Coles. I've made a few notes, Richard, but nice to see you. And just as a little intro to big you up for everybody, but Richard is a chartered construction manager and founder of Richard Coles Building. And over 4 decades, he's shaped a site-first way of working, designs that survives contact with reality is one of his maxims, sequencing that protects performance and a quiet insistence on craft and accountability. He is selective about his clients, practical about supply chains, and judges success by what it's like to live in the building a year later. From listed barns to contemporary low-energy homes across Surrey and West Sussex, this is where, Richard, you ply your trade. And can I just say, it is a real pleasure to have a practitioner, a contractor, which, however you want to describe yourself on the podcast. It's lovely to see you. Richard, just, I think for the sake of everybody, just give us a little intro about yourself rather than me giving you what I've just said. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and then we can get into it.
Well, hi, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Well, yeah, I mean, I've come up through the industry over 40 years. Started with a major contractor back in my late teens, and one thing and another, and graduated from university and eventually became a chartered construction manager, operating pretty much solely in the residential sector, and working really as a general contractor. And I guess about 5 or 6 years ago, in fact, I'd had a vague interest prior to it, but I'd nothing more than that. But started getting interested in passive house and low energy, and I think really what I think changed my perspective was getting more into that. And during the lockdown, as we all had time on our hands, I went a little bit further and did the certified passive house consultants course, which I think was very good. At that time, and I was the only contractor on the course on that cohort, and I'd got fairly sort of quizzical looks from members of the other members on the course, most of which were architects or M&E consultants and so on and so forth. And I made it quite clear at the time that my interest was not to become a consultant, although I seem to have lapsed into that for various reasons, but so that I would have a deeper understanding of building physics and what it's all about. And I'm very, very pleased I did, because I mentioned to you before, Will, I will not, as a matter of principle, criticize other members of the profession, but I think there's a skills gap across the construction industry, full stop, and that predominantly refers to the production and delivery side, but there is also a massive skills gap with regards to knowledge and expertise on the professional designing side and so on and so forth. And just to qualify that, well, not much to qualify that, but I am currently working on a project where the architects are fantastic architects. They've got a great reputation. They turn out some amazing work, but I'm looking at stuff at detailing and things like that, and where the intention was right, but they haven't got it right, and I have literally in the last 48 hours had to refer to experts who have basically changed the detailing. So that's really where it is. So I think I might have strayed a little bit, but so
Don't worry about it.
general contract into more specialized work.
It leads us into where I kind of wanted to start this, which was not shying away from really big questions to which there is certainly no one answer. But the question that I know you and I have talked about before relates to this, which is the question is, who designs what gets built? And as soon as you start looking at that, we are, as a merchant, we sit between the two. So on the one hand, we see manufacturing, we see specification, we see architects, we see building professionals, building physicists. On the other hand, we have builders. We have people who come and buy product from us, and we see it. We hear from both sides, as it were. So when you're looking at, let's use this as an example for this one now, but to illustrate it. But when you're looking at building a property for somebody, how does that, how do people choose what gets built? How do you know what to build? Where does that start?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I think it's based on experience, to be perfectly honest with you, Will. I mean, there are things now that I do in experience and instinct, that so often you instinctively know how to move from, once you've got the drawings, gone through the tendering process and negotiating process, one thing another, and then you had to start on site, and that's where really you start to really get into the buildability and what methodology you're going to use and so on and so forth. But yeah, a lot of it is experience and instinct. Although, and again, this is something I know you and I have broached on before, and we'll probably get into maybe a little bit more detail going forward, is that this latest legislation, the Building Safety Act, which is not a very good title for it really. That has enormous ramifications, and the secondary legislation around it is placing a huge amount of responsibility and accountability on stakeholders, which is the term that is actually used within the Act. So yeah, who decide what actually gets built? I think we had a more pragmatic approach in the past, and empirical processes, whereas I don't think we going forward, I don't think we're going to be able to rely on those.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there are certain parameters which are fixed, aren't they? Which you can sort of rely on being boxed in. Forgive the pun, but the shape of the building, the aspect of the building, the local planners are going to have something to say about it. An architect can design a building to a brief from a client, and a structural engineer can give you the engineering. But it's kind of the delivery process as well. I mean, the one you gave earlier on, the example you gave earlier on, I think is pretty common. I think most people would agree, is that either somebody questions a design choice or a material choice, or there are some other restrictions put in place, such as, I don't know, maybe availability, or probably worse, knowledge about the product if you don't know about it, or if your supplier doesn't know about it. I mean, we do see this every now and again with quite unusual things being specified onto projects and people struggling to get hold of them. And this is before we've got anywhere near to price. I mean, presumably from the initial stages, somebody's got a budget in mind. So it's an enormously complex situation. So bearing that in mind, I mean, when you're engaged with a project on that basis, what do you normally get? Are you normally getting full plans from the architect? Effectively build this, Richard. Yeah.
Well, again, this is a moot point, and it's again, it's a sensitive subject. I've done for two fairly complicated projects, I'd say, not so much big projects, but fairly complicated contracts in the last 2 years. And I hate to use the term, but you've got CAD junkies basically churning out loads and loads of drawings that don't, but no specifications and no schedule of works. And I mean that. This is the one that we finished. It's a fabulous job. It's on the website. It really is a fabulous job. The architects did an amazing design. They were last year. They were. I'm probably giving too much information here, but they were voted the RIBA Young Architectural Practice of the Year. But and that's great, and they're a great bunch of guys, but they do tend to rely on the keyboards and software rather than providing schedules of works and specifications, and that caused us a huge amount of problems. Just by example, I've got a bricklayer that's working for me. He's been working for me for 25 years. He's a fantastic artisan, and takes a huge amount of pride in his work. And he very nearly had a nervous breakdown as a consequence of having to try and work out how to build this, or he knew how to build it. The brickwork, we had four drawings that went into minute detail on how to do Flemish bond brickwork. Well, Carl and his father, and the father in particular, just looked at these drawings and said, well, that isn't how it's done. Just tell us what you want and we'll do it.
I mean, it is intriguing, isn't it? I mean, I think there is the potential for people to be, stymied by data. It's too easy to have too much data. But what intrigues me about this, about how people think about things, is a couple of things you said early on in this conversation were to do with knowledge and to do with goodwill and to do with trust, etc. None of these things can appear on a spreadsheet anywhere. There's no column J for goodwill or trust or. So a lot of the things that are affecting this. What intrigues me about this is that we spend all this time designing buildings that we want to have built, and then it seems to me that there is an element of compromise that could creep in almost anywhere as soon as it leaves the office. Okay, off you go. I mean, do you think? How do you think there's enough of an understanding about what the architects are trying to achieve, or do you think maybe what they should be doing is the output should be they're not speaking your language, but language with the output. They're giving you their output rather than the output you want or need.
I don't know. Could you repeat that, please?
So I'm just saying, but if we all, what I'm trying to say is that people tend to speak the same language to each other within their profession. When they have to cross from one profession to another, comes out of the architect's office, goes into somewhere else, and ends up with you. If they're still speaking that same language, if you're getting sent all these CAD drawings, would you wanted that information presented in a different way? Is that what you were saying when you said that?
Well, I mean, just to sort of put that into perspective a little bit, and again, I've had this a couple of times. Really, is that you've got these CAD systems that they will turn out components, roof, walls, floors, etc., and I've actually had somebody say, well, that's where the CAD package falls apart. I said, but there aren't any junctions. There's no eaves detail. There are no floor wall details. There are no wall to intermediate floor details, and so on and so forth. And just to get recap on that, the particular architect, I was chatting to him. I said, you've got an amazing CAD package. It turns out it's some amazing drawings. I said, well, which one is it? And he said, it's a pretty standard CAD package. I said, oh, really? I said, well, how did you manage to generate some of what you've generated? And he said to me, well, if you go back to the tender issue, there were no junction details. He said, we have written or we have adopted and built the CAD system up so that we can do various things that are not default within that package. So yeah, it's a difficult one, really.
But did you get what you wanted in terms of? Because I mean, I know I'm very well aware of your. I suppose it probably is an obsession with buildability. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, these things not just distraction? Could they be done better? Where would you be looking at for this what would you want if you were designing this? Say, this is the output that I want in order to be able to build better, more accurately, quicker, etc.
It's difficult. I mean, now we're going back into fundamentals. In as much, I don't think, and it's not. It isn't a fault of. I think more the younger generation of architects who are very good, but the RIBA seems to be steeped in elitism, if you like, and I don't think these guys are being taught about the fundamentals in building and construction. And I know that when I was at university, the building civil engineering department was right next door to the architectural department. And back in those days, the architect students in the first year of the architect student courses, the students we all used to go to the same lectures, and these were lectures on materials and construction techniques and M&E and so on and so forth. So back in those days, the architectural students had a good grounding on building processes and so on and so forth. I'm sure somebody on the panel would be able to correct me, but I don't think that they get that same grounding. And it goes back, historically, to, architects back in the 16th, well, prior to that, really, 17th century, so on and so forth. They all came from trade backgrounds, and it's only sort of in the last 100 or so years that architects seem to have divorced themselves from the sort of the overall process.
Why do you think that's happened then?
Um, I think it's I think it's elitism, and there isn't just elitism in the in the architectural profession, and has occurred through the RIBA. We've had it in the civil engineering profession, and we're now starting to get it in the building profession, the CIOB. I mean, these days, you have to, and I have to be very careful here because being a chartered construction manager, if there's anybody from the CIOB
These
looking,
are
through, will be
observations, not
referring me
criticism.
to the what's its department?
I
Ethics.
mean, there is an enormous amount of paperwork involved, and even to us, we come across acronyms every now and again. We look at things, what's that? And it's another certifying body, another approval body related to something. There seems to be an enormous amount of infrastructure that supports construction, which in reality is somebody drawing something on paper and then somebody putting it together on site. Um, but to my mind, is you've obviously managed to work a way around of dealing with all of this, and is dealing with it what you do?
Yeah, yes, I think it. Well, it is, Will. But as I said before, it's from having. Let's have a look now. Let's get down to the nitty gritty. I'm 69 years old, and I started in the profession when I was 17. That's 52 years. That's over half a century of experience, and I think I don't get up in the morning thinking, oh, well, how am I going to deal with this problem? I sort of get up in the morning and it's I just go full on, if you like, charge of the light brigade.
I
You
mean,
know,
I'm
I just
interested. I'm interested in the consequences of this. So, since you began building and were involved in building, the consequence of doing is the principal consequence of all of this that everything's just become more expensive. I mean, I'm not. Are we building better buildings than we were building when you first started?
No, we're not. I don't
So,
think. And
the world, according to Richard, we're not only are things more expensive, but they're worse than they were.
well, this is one of the things. It's this, and I know we'll come on to it. So I think it's mentioned somewhere, but and I think this will change because we've got the Building Safety Act and we've got the upcoming Future Home Standard. So the performance gap is the big. I don't know if there's elephant in the room, but it's just a fact of life at the moment. But that gap will have to be closed. It's as simple as that. And that will, it will increase costs. It's very, very easy to fire PIR into a cavity. And this is one of my big hobby horses. Every time I drive past a site, and you do, and you look in, and there's this house that's been built, or a block of flats, or so on and so forth. And inevitably, there will be an opening in that wall, the external wall, and you'll look in there, and there'll be PIR with 10 mil, 15 mil, 20 mil gaps there, and you're thinking, I'm not going to get out the actual stats. Alex will be able to do that for me. But you get a 10 mil, a hole the size of a sixpence, sorry, 5 pence piece, in a cavity insulation. It equates to some phenomenal amount of heat loss. And until we address this and skill our people up, then we won't be able to solve the situation. And we do. I've got some really good guys working for me. One of them sitting in the background, looking very wryly at me, and then a couple of other guys that are out on site, and they, it's really gratuitous. I went out to site yesterday, and we were putting on some XPS insulation below in the substructure, and it's as tight as anything. It's unbelievable, and it was just I've got photographs of it in one thing and another, which I have to do because the certifier on that project will want to see them, and so on and so forth. So we are, but I am mindful of the fact that everything takes longer and time is money. So and it'd be
It's
interesting.
what intrigues me about this is that we'll come back to the Building Safety Act and we'll come back to the performance gap. But related to it, you've got principally there are two ways of motivating people to do stuff, which are predominantly you can regulate people or you can reward people. And so there will be incentives to behave in a certain way. There'll be disincentives to working a way you don't want people to work. But if that's the three-legged stool, the third leg is then the behavioural side of it, which is getting people to understand. So I mean, I think I experience this a lot, but I don't think it's common. But it's a lot with our customers. Is that people like yourself and others involved in these projects will take the time to explain to other participants why they're doing something, And I can remember seeing one of the most compelling things I saw was when I was at a training on airtightness, being told that the aggregated gap for a standard, I think it was about an 80 square meter house built to regs at that time, would have been the size of an ATM in the wall. So you could build an airtight building with the size of the ATM, but the aggregated gap for a passive house at that time was the size of a credit card.
Yeah.
Now you think to yourself, when you drive past a building site which has got the PIR in the cavity, you're just thinking to yourself, I could probably aggregate the gap in one room to be more than that, let alone the whole blasted house with a roof on it. So I think I think it's partly it's the engagement thing. So one of the benefits for your business is that you take the time to have a long-term view about engaging the people you work with. So your trades that you work with and the other partners you work with to a sort of common purpose. Yeah, you all agree what you're trying to do. You're not doing something without the knowledge of why, So you could put insulation in quite casually and not be aware at all that it's causing you a problem later on in the building.
Sorry, Will, I've just got distracted. Ketke, just looking at this question. That brings the question: would your company consider sharing or publishing a resource that showed based on your?
Have you got? You're reading a comment.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can't see him on my
Ketke, if you
screen.
don't mind, I'll refer you to Pevsner, if that's okay.
Let me just turn the chat.
Building types. We don't. It would be great if we could, if I had the time to sit down and write a book on Flemish bond, garden wall bond, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, I don't. And educate those in the industries that are churning out CAD packages. Would that make a difference? I don't know. That's another question. Maybe you and I will speak about that, Kit, some other
Look,
time.
I'm happy to. If anybody wants to ask any questions, then please do, and we'll have a look at them. I've actually just switched on chats in my room so that I can see them on my screen. So I think to my mind, when you look at it, trying to explain the performance gap to somebody who's not involved in construction, they think to themselves, "Why you don't get a performance gap with a car, or an aeroplane when you make one? Why would you get one with a building?"
Well, this is it. I mean, and we've all heard the expression that building is not an exact science. I mean, unless you start getting into modern methods of construction and construction of construction off a site and so on and so forth, cars and televisions and so on and so forth are all produced on a production line where they for the production line to be efficient, they have to factor out all the inefficiencies. Sorry, it's a sort of whatever. But you get up on a building site, and then I think if somebody was to do some research, you'd find that the quality of build during the summer months would be probably quite higher than the quality of build in the middle of January, February, when you no, don't anybody pull me up on that, but laying bricks,
Oh, it's a really
you
interesting
only
point.
lay bricks on a 3 degrees or above on a rising thermometer. But it's and in the range coming down and so on and so forth.
I mean, it's a really interesting point to me, this about the performance gap, because you've got skills in every area. So let's assume you're a highly skilled bricklayer, you've got a really skilled carpenter, you've got other people, but you've got skilled architects, etc. And yet we still have the performance gap. Yeah, we still. On that basis, tell me about how you've told me before that you build long term, and you want to know your buildings are still performing after a year or so. You can tell, you judge your own quality by how buildings stand up, and how do you do that? What do you post monitor some of the occupancy of the buildings that you've built, or do you do it anecdotally by talking to the occupants?
Anecdotally, overwhelmingly. I mean, I've only sort of started doing post occupancy monitoring in since we've started doing NFIT, really, and even then, it's not really scientific. I mean, the building that I live in that was an NFIT is, I'm just constantly monitoring the amount of electricity we use, and there is no gas or anything like that. So, as far as I'm not as far as I'm concerned, but when you get to the levels of air tightness that we've got to, and if you cross-reference that with the amount of energy you're using, then you know whether you've closed that performance gap. Because if you haven't closed that performance gap, it will show up on the amount of energy that you're using.
I mean, I'm intrigued as well because I've been out with Paul Jennings, who we had on some not so long ago, who's an air tester, and we've thermally imaged. I've been out when he's been thermally imaging buildings, and there are tools you've got to reveal, what a building is doing once it's been built, or in that case, prior to refurbishment. But someone else has just picked up on the comments about this practical knowledge and experience in the industry, and I think this is part of it. Are we all just too busy just getting our heads down and ticking the boxes that we've got to get ticked to link this up properly? Is that what's happening? Or, does it need someone like you to sit in the middle with an appreciation of both sides to kind of try and iron out those gaps, Richard?
Yeah, I think there is an element of that. I mean, the other thing is again, it's too easy to criticize, and I don't really like. That's not the right way forward. It's not a possible positive way forward, because one thing that we keep hearing it this across the spectrum in society, and that's collaboration. We need far more collaboration, and a lot less of people trying to tick their own boxes and not worrying too much about other people's boxes, and then criticizing everybody else when nothing actually works the way it should do. But I remember going back, as I said, 52 years, boys and girls. When I started, there was a clerk of the works. How
Yeah.
many people on? There are 21 people here. How many people have actually worked with a clerk of the works in the panel that we have here today? I'd suggest it would probably be less than 50%.
We never hear of them. We always used to have a laugh when I was doing steelwork, going on and asking for the cow.
Mm.
Because we clerk of works, I don't know that you do see them anymore. But I mean, I suppose the other thing which is interesting is it's like many of these things, which are the implication is it's for somebody's convenience or benefit. Yeah, but whose? The ultimate owner of all these issues and problems is the occupant of the house. So it's kind of unforgivable in many respects to hand them all of these problems. You just get the job done, get signed off, and then get on, and then the problems themselves become aggregated until you have a leaky house that doesn't perform in the way it was intended. But so when you're building, how do you monitor your progress when you're building to make sure that you're not aggregating, issues and problems?
Well, this is that's the answer to that is quite simple, and my colleague here will say that I generally, it will be very rare that I don't visit every one of my sites at least 3 times a week. So that'd be every other day. And I have to say, on occasions, I'm thinking to myself, I've got something pressing in the office. I've got a tender that I'm desperate to get out of, and bit of business that I want to get in. And I'm driving to a site thinking to myself, Richard, why are you doing this? Why are you going through this process? You've got good guys. I've got good site managers, and they don't need to be, they don't need their hands held. They're good guys. But nevertheless, I still find myself going through this ritual of visiting the sites, and I'm pleased I do, because especially as we've now got more and more into low energy and passive and one thing and another, is that I am picking up on little things that I correct. Um, and there you go. I mean, partly because there is no definitive formal specification or schedule, or this is how it will be done, or drawing details and so on and so forth. And yeah, it's yeah,
I'm intrigued by that because I think what you'll find is that you're also creating other benefits by doing so. I think the client impact is definitely one of them. I mean, it depends on the nature of the contact and how you're being paid. But if you're being paid by the visit, then the client might be a bit worried if you're pitching up five, every day, charging him for every day. But more importantly, I think that just that aside, I think the idea that you are giving confidence to a whole group of people, including the client side, will be really important. It also maintains a team mentality, doesn't it? That we're all in this together and that there's some kind of continuity and discussion between everybody. So, I mean, what about sequencing as well? Does that play a part in eliminating the niggles and the potential gaps?
Absolutely. And I'm a firm believer in programming, Gantt charts and so on and so forth. I've normally got one to hand, and I can't find one. But I
Who
do.
doesn't love a Gantt chart?
And at the end of the day, and I say it to the guy, and I go onto site and with the Gantt chart, and we will be doing this in this sequence, and I see them. These guys that worked for me for 25 years, Carl in particular, and their eyes glaze over. Oh God, not again. Richard with one of his charts, and if they and I can have a project that will last for 9 months. I probably have half a dozen, so day one, here it goes. This is what we're going to be doing in 6 weeks' time, we're going to be doing that. Of course, in 6 weeks' time, we're not doing that. We'd probably more likely slip behind or so on and so forth. But I firmly believe that you need these things because they give us a perspective on this, and they know where my desire to be is. But they do slip, and they are. We have a laugh about it and one thing or another, but they are a valuable tool, and they do assist in factoring out um,
Potential
that
mistakes.
aren't logical and aren't sequential in the manner in which they should be.
I think that's particularly true when it comes to airtightness, because obviously the one serious and unforgivable mistake is to go back and have to fix something when it's then inaccessible or is going to, highly disruptive if you didn't sort out the airtightness layer first. I mean, we've got quite a good number of examples of horror stories where, things like staircases have been put in before the walls made airtight, and then you've tested and it leaks like a sieve, and then what do you do? I think one of the things which just like struck me is was interesting about what you said about how long you've been at it. No offense, Richard, but I'm approaching your age as well. Is that there's an old joke, isn't there, that we know it works in practice. Now, can we make it work in theory? The classic example of that is a steam regulator, which was invented by Watt. I mean, it took 100 years or so to Faraday, I think it was, before anybody worked out the maths as to how it actually worked. But it was deployed on engines all over the place. I think when you look at buildings built in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of them using brickies, regular trades, and wet plastered. They were airtight just as inherently airtight. They were good, solid buildings. And I just wonder whether our obsession with proving everything sometimes has caused us a problem. Whereas we know perfectly well, if you were to pay to the wet trades to do it, you went and wet plastered everything, then you would be airtight.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of, I mean, Manchester University, isn't it? Salford, I think they've got two massive installations up there that are researching into new buildings and how they should be built and so on and so forth. So, but yeah, how that all actually translates onto into how we eventually build things, I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of rambling a bit here, but I think the very fact that those I'm probably talking around myself. The very fact that those installations are funded by volume house builders would suggest that and these guys would have done their research because their bottom line, they're more largely concerned with the fiduciary aspects of it, and so they wouldn't be putting all this money into the design if they didn't think that it would reflect in their balance sheet some years down the line. So um, yes.
But isn't that the convenience thing? I mean, who was dot and dab convenient for? You know, it was convenient for the contractor. It was a much quicker way to put up a hygienic surface you can plaster and finish. There's lots of things in the construction industry which are made convenient for people who are not the end user of the house. The house that I was brought up in was built in the early 1950s, and it had concrete block walls and it had wet plaster, and it was okay. It let itself down because it had crickle windows. It had metal windows in there and no double glazing. But the basic fabric of the building was inherently sound. It was pretty solid. And I just sometimes wonder when you're looking at all the different ways of building and different methodologies, which I kind of want to come on to in a minute, is who is this done for? Because if it's just done for shareholder value, you're not necessarily focusing on the outcome for the occupier. That will simply be to the current regulations, and that by definition is the worst building you can build by law. So if it's an interesting one. So when you come across somebody like you who's got a client who's going way beyond building regs, that's your start point, not your end point. That to me seems to be potentially the preserve of anybody who's not a developer. And so it would. I mean, is that? Do you have a tendency then to favour more traditional build methods?
I do actually. I've just picked up on Alex's Alex Clifford. Nice to see you here, Alex. Comment there. To me, dot and dab dry lining is it's anathema, and it's counterintuitive. And the number of times I've seen dry line walls in specifications, and that there goes back to the question that you asked at the outset: who decides what's being built? I will not use I will not use dot and dab dry lining. It's all wet trades, because I think that the dot and dab, the dry lining and dot and dab came out of the commercial sector, which possibly you can justify it. But who wants a house that's got dry lining in it? It just doesn't seem to work to me.
I mean, there are endless videos on YouTube of snaggers who are going around, and owners of developer-built houses with these appalling lists. I mean, it's almost entertainment. Well, it is entertainment, and you just sit there slack-jawed, thinking, how on earth did they get away with this and get that signed off? And it does give trade a bad name. But I think that so it's not really just who decides what gets built. It's kind of also who decides what the output of the building is, how livable is it, how energy efficient it is. I think, do you think when you talk to your clients, do they have expectations or an understanding of what an energy efficient house actually is?
That's an interesting one, and I'm going to have to pause there for a minute and think about that. And in the meantime, Alex, it'd be interesting to know whether the client is building this £5 million house to sell, or whether he's actually going to be living in it. I can understand if he wants to sell it, flip it, to use coin and industry and expression, then I can understand why he's dry lining. If he was living in it, I'm surprised that he would want to dry line it.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is another thing again. So that's kind of the question I'm asking, which is, is social housing have a different view of their housing? We sell a lot of energy efficient and natural and sustainable products into social housing because they have a very long-term interest in it. They have a long-term interest in the well-being and of their tenants, and they also have issues relating to maintenance and the cost of running and everything else. So look at it. So Yeah, maybe part of that is contextual as well. So, what about your clients who you're building for?
They will probably be led by, to a degree, by they would ask my opinion. Um, if they say, "Oh well, dry lining is the modern way to do it," I say, "Well, arguably it is, but it's not. It's just the three little piggies and whatnot, houses of straw, houses of whatnot, and houses of brick. It comes down to that. And I don't doubt that if you went back to 300 years and you explain the context, we didn't have British gypsum products in those days, and it's only since we've got those products we've got all these problems with building moisture and so on and so forth as well. But if you did go back that far and mention that to the designers of those times, I think they would say, well, where's the logic in dry lining? There is none.
Yeah. I mean, but there's lots
You're
of,
talking to somebody who just hates it, full stop.
I mean, there are lots of anomalies in building, but I think that it comes back to this point about who's it convenient for. I think quite a lot of, there's an argument to be made that if you make something easier to do, then you require slightly less skill to do it, and it's likely to be more predictable. And certainly the advent of things like a lot of woodworking tools are really, really welcome. Not having to use a hand chisel and a hand saw to do everything, absolutely bloody marvelous. And modern woodworking tools, but there are certain things that get injected in there. Dry lining is one of them. Dot and dab is definitely one of them, where you just think to yourself, this is only for the convenience of shareholder value. This is only to make more money. Yeah.
Mm.
But you're just going back to this. I mean, but you're not building to building regulation standard. You're building well beyond this. I mean, especially if you're getting up to passive level again. And surely, isn't there a lesson to be learned here with the processes to achieve NFIT or passive standard that could be adopted by regular builders in terms of the transfer of information between all the appointed trades and people on the job?
Yeah, sorry, Will. I keep getting distracted, and I'm just looking
Try
at
not to be.
from Bethany.
I can see what you do.
Bethany, I think the answer there is that you have your service voids outside or inside or outside on on the warm side of the construction, so that you're not penetrating the airtightness layer. Sorry, Will.
But just to add to, we'll come back to that. Just to add to that, in the old days, then it used to be chased out.
Yeah.
Chased out, conduit put in and plastered over. So that would typically how you do it.
Mm.
So yeah, going back to we're just sort of chatting around about people's understanding of what energy efficiency is. I mean, we do encounter people who've never lived in a passive house home before, but are building one. So their only reference point is standard housing. And then, of course, it's a much bigger difference when they get into a passive house, when they live in one, and they feel the difference and experience the difference in terms of comfort or bills. But when you're talking to your customers about if they're asking you to build them an energy efficient home or a sustainable home or the kind of homes you build, Richard, what do they kind of how much are you educating them about what one of those buildings actually is?
Well, fortunately for us, it's a sensitive, possibly a sensitive subject area. Is that most of the people that we work for are well informed, put it that way, and they have an understanding. They read the right papers and they have an understanding about what energy efficient homes are. That's possibly the sum of the. Yeah, I mean they do. I mean, the society as a whole is becoming better informed, and expectations are rise as a consequence of that. We've those of us that work in the low energy, so on and so forth, and install. You heard stories about in social housing where people turn off the MVHR, and then but MVHR it's very, very economical. Or I certainly the running of my own VHR system is very, very low. I was quite surprised actually. I'd gone away for a weekend and turned absolutely just about everything off apart from the refrigerator, or a week, the refrigerator and the MVHR, and was staggered about how much energy was not being used.
Well, I think one of the things that intrigues me about that is the fact that we see this a lot is post occupancy. Once somebody's in there, they reveal things that manufacturers should pick up on. The fact that you were staggered about how well it performs once you'd had it obviously didn't make any difference to the decision to do it in the first place. So if they'd said to you, Mr. Cole, you are going to get staggering savings off your MVHR unit.
Yeah.
Then when it happened, you'd be going, you told me and it's worked and I'm happy. But the fact that you bought it and then found out that it performed in a different way or better than you'd been told, that feedback loop is not working, because the manufacturer should be looking back and going, actually, hang on a minute.
I think that it's all born out of natural societal cynicism, isn't it? Really, it's
Well, it'll never catch on it the way.
well, I mean, it just goes with everything, doesn't it? Where you always surprised when the roast dinner come a lump of roast beef. Sorry about any vegetarians or anything on the call, but
Roast
when
area.
that roast beef comes out exactly the way it should do, there's always that almost sense of surprise and delight. The fact that it's going to come out like that because mummy's cooked it like that for the last 52 years or whatever. But yeah, I think
But that's again, that is the repetitive hand, the sort of system two learning is, becomes system one learning. It becomes a habit. Bricklayers don't think about driving. Bricklayers think about laying bricks, but it's intuitive to them. It's natural. It's just what they do. They have that sort of autonomous way of they just sense it. I think that's another thing which we encounter. You've said it several times in this chat, Richard, is just using your nose, intuition, a suspicion. You just want to look, you just want to check. That plays a part as well, which again, it's impossible to codify, but it is one of the things that you can learn through experience, that you acquire through experience, rather. So I'm also intrigued a little bit about when you're talking to customers, because this might be new, is we do see quite a lot of what appear to be common sense ideas in construction not really getting any traction, and yet other sort of slightly less, maybe it's to do with known faults, okay, that the faults of something you're going to use, but something you're going to use that's new, you might not know the faults of. But how do you broach this with your clients and with the people you're working with when they are looking at something new, or them doing it for the first time, where they might be a little bit unsure about it?
Interesting question. I probably will have most of the knowledge that I impart on the guys that work for me. I will have done my absolute best to make sure that I've researched it, and I'm happy that what I've researched and what I'm saying will work, if that's any sort of answer at all. Yeah,
Where do you go to learn? So give us pick an example. Say MVHR. There would have been Richard Coles never used MVHR before, gets a job, MVHR required. How did you begin that journey to learn about that and to make yourself feel comfortable with it?
Well, that's an interesting one, a very valid one actually. I mean, I had installed a number of MVHR units prior to my having embarked on Passive House and so on and so forth. I had, as a contractor, installed some MVHR units, and I think back now, and I cannot believe that they were installed in such a manner. And I think it's fairly safe to say there's an MVHR unit not far from where I'm currently sitting that we installed probably 10 years ago, and I doubt that has ever had the filters changed. And I mean that. And then, of course, when you go on to Passipedia, and the Passive House Trust publish a document for Passive House components, and I ended up with a company who I consider excellent, Rod Williams. Won't go any further than that, but he was absolutely the way they installed it in the first instance, all rigid ducting and no flexible ducting was fantastic. And then, he wouldn't let me turn it on until after the building was complete. He said, "Oh no, no, you'll get dust in the system." And it took 6 hours to commission. And I thought, well, none of the other ones that we've ever put in have took anything more than it any time longer than it took to flick a switch, and that was the commissioning. And I looked at the way he did it, and subsequently, and of course we had to do with the final airtight test, and we had to take all the we had to isolate it and one thing and another. And I sort of phoned him up and said, "Well, why did you do this?" And he said, "Well, that's part of the commissioning process, Richard." So yeah.
So you got an into that through the practical installation of it. What about when you had to what about the first house you did for a customer or a client when MVHR was going? Did you have to did you encompass that in the whole package that we're having an energy efficient building, energy efficient shell, or was it did you get it in there on the ticket of you've got to have one? That's the rules because your air tightness is at a certain level.
No, the first one was, as I said, it was back, and that was my first experience of MVHR. Is the people that were selling it, they didn't actually install it. So they said, well, you if you've got a decent carpenter, he can install it. And why a carpenter would want to install an MVHR system? But I was naive at that time, and so we just took it on board. I don't know actually who ended up installing it. Um, so, but it went in. I've never had any complaints.
This was the one where the commissioning was that's the on switch and you just turn
Yeah,
it on and there you go.
yeah. And then we've had another example where I had an irate client phone up the MVHR people and said, "Well, I can't hear it, so it can't be working." It was working perfectly well. That's, you know,
This is another bit of feedback that's missing as well. So the idea maybe just needs to put telltales onto his vents so that he can see whether something's moving in or out.
Well, I mean, funnily enough, I mean, ironically, goes back to the the societal cynicism or whatever you want to call it. But for the first weeks, months that I lived in the house that I'm living in with the MVHR, I would quite often in the bedrooms upstairs. There, it's into a lofts area, and the MVHR the outlets are located on the wall, and on a number of occasions, I find myself going up the stairs. And is it working? Is it working? Is it on? The lights are flashing in the plant room, and you go up and you put your hand up next to the vent, and you can feel air coming out of it. So it must be on.
It's a really interesting point. I mean, obviously, electric cars are a good example because they run silently, and most electric cars, especially when they're reversing, will make a noise of some description. There's one of the new, I believe, one of the new Audis, which has actually got uses a speaker system to play the engine of a high performance car, which you can turn on and off for a bit of fun. And we've been working with a company for a long time, based up in the northwest of England, who were for a considerable amount of time were actually trying to develop a noiseless kettle. And one of the things that we discovered when we were talking about this fairly quickly is people don't actually want a noiseless kettle for the very reason they don't know it's on. It's the same day, by the way, the same thing was done with a shaver, with an electric shaver that didn't make a noise, didn't make a buzzing noise. People say, I have no idea whether it's working or not, so that there are odd behavioral things going on here, aren't they? I mean, maybe the thing to do with an MVHR unit is just to simply have a panel with a flashing light on it. If the light's flashing, it's on. You don't need a noise or you need anything else which would be intrusive. You can have something relatively modest. But it again, these are things that are encountered post occupancy. I'm also interested in the front end. So it's all very well to meet someone like yourself who says, I was slightly surprised that after having moved into my house, I saved a load of money. The MVHR was really quiet. But these are people who've already decided to do that. You encounter people who haven't yet decided to do this, and you've got to persuade them or set it in context for them. Do you find that's an issue when you're talking to customers? Do you encounter resistance about building to higher levels of energy efficiency or quality?
No, not really. Just sort of thinking about how to frame the answer. No, I don't. I mean, if you can. if you can sit them down and explain to them without technical jargon, then people, people in, they will take these things on board. And
You get asked to build.
if you don't, what you don't want to do is to be patronizing, or, the two worst things is to try and patronize something, people, and the other thing is to try and sell them something. You can educate them, I think, is what you need to do, but you don't sell them, you don't tell them what they have to,
I mean,
what's good for them.
I'm quite interested because we have encountered people who said, "Oh, I'm building an eco house," and then what they go on to describe may be described as an eco house by some people, but to certain other people that we talk to, they'd be horrified because it's nowhere near what they consider to be an eco house. So this sort of change. Where do these people anchor themselves in where an eco house begins? Is it understood that building regulations at the moment, if you're fully compliant, would be the minimum entry standard, and that what you're aiming for is above that, performance above building regulations?
Well, I mean, once we get the sorry if I'm sort of going out tangentially, but with the future home standard, the U values on those are getting very close to passive house U values. Apart from the fact the one exception being wall U values, and I think that is possibly a conscious decision by the policy makers, is that they don't want, if you're not careful, you'll end up without any brick built houses, and we love our brick built houses in this country. And go to some of the places in the continent, they're all rendered systems. So they will accept under the latest 0.18, I think, watts per square meter. Okay, 1.18, right, and that to me is quite a high level. But I think, well, yeah, but it's quite difficult to achieve. Somebody's going to contradict me, but it's quite difficult to achieve a lower U value if you want to use a brick outside skin. That leads on to a whole conversation in itself. But sorry, Will,
What I was trying to get at was the perception of what is regarded as energy efficient performance in a building. I mean, you can build a building to any shape. I mean, notwithstanding some of the issues that dormers, etc., and complicated shapes might have. Pretty much, you can make a lot of buildings very energy efficient. But I just think that for the majority of people who are not involved in our industry, which is sustainable construction and energy efficient construction, their perception, what's anchoring them, are really badly performing buildings, especially if they've lived in a building that's not that's predominantly built sort of 1980s, 1990s, 80s, way back to probably to the sort of early 80s, 70s. There were some shocking buildings built then. So what they're living in is leaky, cold, or colder, potentially colder buildings. So I think it's part of this is what people's perception of an energy efficient house is. Yeah.
I think that then this goes back to the whole thing. I don't, there's an awful lot that you can create a very, very comfortable home with a fabric first approach. So again, you use the term, build tight and ventilate right. So if you've got your insulation and your air tightness, and the only bit of whizzo kit that you need is your MVHR. Air source heat pumps are the way, and that is the future. That's without question. And then your PVs and various other technical renewable technology we build in. But you can get a long way to you can achieve complete acceptability just with a fabric first and whatnot approach, as I said.
It's the most reasonable argument, isn't it? If you build a building that demands less energy to keep it comfortable at the point at the level you want it at, then that's more energy efficient than one which requires a higher energy input to keep it that way. So it is an interesting one. It kind of brings us back to the point where we started this, Richard, doesn't it? Was who decides what gets built. So if you're deciding to build an energy efficient house, then you've got to be able to define it. So you define it against the standard. It might be passive, it might be building regs, etc. Okay, and then it's got to be built without compromise. So it's got to be built with no performance gap, which is where you guys come in, because you're the ones who will help mitigate that more efficiently than anybody else. Yeah.
Mm.
And so I noticed that we're sort of coming to the end of our hour, which is a shame because I'm enjoying hearing all about this. So just to sort of wrap it up. I mean, where do you see this going next? Just for with the introduction of the Building Safety Act and Future Home Standard.
Well, I'd like to think that the future housing stock, and especially as the more um, um, the more forward-thinking volume house builders, let's get away from the actual architecture, but which is another conversation. I'd like to think that the quality of housing stock will be improved.
Mm.
But as we know, and to sort of diversify again, is that 90% of the housing stock will have already been built by the time we got to whenever it is to reach the 2050 target. So
Yeah, we're already adding to the crap buildings already that we've got.
exactly. So we've got this big retrofit program that needs to be implemented and excelled.
Do you do much retrofit, or are you predominantly new build and larger work?
Well,
Well, I know you're doing Enefit, so you
we
must be.
do, yeah, we do. It's I would say, funnily enough, actually, it's at the moment it's the two projects that we got on a retrofit, but the I've just literally shook hands on and the procurement of that project is quite interesting in itself, on a fabulous sort of grand. I don't like to use the term grand designs type house, but that's exactly what it is. The location and the design is phenomenal. And funnily enough, actually, the client said to me just yesterday when we shook hands, and that it was really quite an unusual procurement process, because halfway through the our conversation, the client just stood up and said, "Richard, I want you to build this house for me," and shook hands with me there and then. I said, "Well, yeah, but there's still quite a lot to bottom out with regards to budgets primarily." And he said, "Well, don't you worry. I'm sure that we will be able to do that, given your approach so far during this meeting." And this is probably the third meeting that I had with him. Then I have full confidence that I'll get what I want. And I did actually say, and he said, "Oh, what do you think about?" The thing is that, and I'll try and keep this short. They are living.
No, carry on. Sorry,
They've got basically it's a bit, they 33 acres, and he has got a Class Q conversion on within the 33 acres, which he's had converted, and it was a kit form home that he bought, and it was by a well-known company. And he said, "My wife loves this house, and I looked in at the energy the reports and that were issued by the builders, and I said to him, look, everything here is passive. Your all your U values, the air, the permeability is 1 cubic meter per square meter per hour." I said, "Well, that's virtually the same as 1 air change per hour." I said, "Well, that's Eminfit, which is very, very close to passive." I said, "Essentially, Murray, you live in a passive house. They've got MVHR, heat pumps, and everything. And I said, well, so if this project that we're negotiating now, and that's where the conversation started out. And I said to him, look, I haven't even we've only got 1 to 100 architect's drawings at the moment for planning purposes. This is what I've put in front of him, and I've had to design the construction detail between an ICF system and a timber framing system, oak for timber framing, green oak timber framing." And I said, we have to get this project, the new build section of it. They're living in the Class Q conversion. Well, it's not a conversion. They actually managed to get a new house on it, but that's another conversation. But I said, you're living in that, and that's created a perfect environment for you. If with this new house that you're building, which hasn't been designed as a passive house, we are going to have to make it a passive house for you. Otherwise, your wife is not going to enjoy the comfort that she currently does. And you're going to be phoning me up and saying, "Richard, it's not as comfortable as
So their
the
anchor,
Danwood house that we put up."
Their answer is
and
the
I
house
said, well,
they're living in. They will judge everything else against that house that they're currently living in.
pardon?
They will judge everything else against that house that they're actually living in.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Whereas if they were coming from a 3-bed semi built in the 1970s, they'd have a completely different view of it.
yeah,
This is one hell of a step up. Richard, listen, we could chat on for ages. It's been lovely having you on. I'm sorry our time is up. But it just, I mean, normally I'd ask you a couple more questions, but we've run out of time. I'm fascinated. Thank you so much. It's so nice to talk to a contractor and to have a contractor onto Thinking Aloud. The whole process is a combination of lots of different of components, and the contractor side of it is definitely one. And we'd probably like to hear more from you in the future. But listen, just remains for me to say thanks very much indeed, Richard.
well, all I can say is 5 minutes into this webinar, I thought to myself, how on earth am I going to keep going for an hour? And my throat's dry, my mouth's dry, and everything. And
Time for a cup of tea.
just on a final thing, Bethany, I think Passive House accredited. Should they be Passive House accredited? I don't think they necessarily have to be accredited, but I think they need to go through a process of education, engaging, and gaining knowledge, and that's
An interesting point. Just chucks in is that we work with lots of architects and technicians, and what we find most of is people who are passive aware and build to passive standards, but accredited. It's nice if you can go through it and you can get the work, but I wouldn't say that it would be. Yeah, maybe you would prefer it. I don't know. That's. I mean, the passive side of this sector is growing and growing, which is very interesting to see. It will take time. That's the last thing. Is all of this takes time.